Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the McConnell Center's program on why we should read. Today we will be discussing Cicero. My name is Hannah Cease, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christian Kopff. Dr. Kopff is a graduate of Haverford College as well as the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he received his doctorate in classics. He then went on to teach at the University of Colorado Boulder in the classics department. While there, from 2004 to 2011, he served as the founding director of the Center for Western Civilization. As a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, he edited a critical edition of the Greek text of Euripides Bacchae. Dr. Kopff is also the author of The Devil Knows Latin, Why America Needs the Classical Tradition, and translated Joseph Pieper, Tradition, Concept, and Claim. He was the recipient of the Hero of Conscience Award from the American Freedom Alliance for his commitment to the advancement of Western ideals and values, and awarded the designation Magister Magnus from the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education. He works with the classicists of the University of Urbino, Italy, on the meter and kilometry of the courses of ancient Greek tragedy. He studies ancient texts and traditions from science to Sophocles that remain important, including what ancient Athenians called democracy and the religion of the Bible. So please, let's welcome Dr. Kopff, who will be discussing why we should read Cicero.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, to be back here, and enjoying this. I've already lost my... That's what I'll do. So the question we have before us is, why read Cicero? And I would even like to modify that a little bit by saying, why get to know Cicero? In The Devil Knows Latin, at one stage, listing a whole bunch of reasons to value the classical tradition and classical education, I mentioned that some people are interested in the ancient world because they get to know two men, Socrates and Jesus, both of whom we know about because they were written about in Greek by people who knew them. But today I'd like to make an argument for a third person to add to our categories, who's Cicero. And in Cicero's case, not only do we have people who knew him, who wrote about him, but we have his speeches, we have his essays and dialogues on political, educational, and philosophical issues, and we have many of his letters, and I'll mention that a little bit later as we go on. Let me start trying to make my point by doing what Homer does in his epics, and what Virgil does in the Aeneid, and what Milton did in Paradise Lost, which is proceed in medias res. That's Horace's expression. Go to the middle of the story, and then I'll leap back a little bit and talk about. But the middle of the story for Cicero and his influence is the beginning of the story for us. In the 17th century, a bunch of Englishmen got on a boat called the Mayflower and sailed across to Massachusetts, what we now know as Massachusetts. And before they landed, they signed a document about what they were going to do when they landed there. It's the Mayflower Compact. And the first volume of Tocqueville's great work on democracy in America begins with the Mayflower Compact. Second volume begins with the French philosopher Descartes, who in fact was a contemporary of the Mayflower Compact, although in my humble opinion had less to do with America than did the Pilgrims. And it's an interesting document. They begin by continuing their allegiance to their sovereign lord, King James. But they are going to form their own way of running themselves, and that is the creation of what they call a civil body politic. Civil comes from Latin roots, body is Anglo-Saxon, politic is Greek. Body is a group, that's one of the meanings of body. Political, we know what that is, secular. As Puritans, they were also going to be members of a body ecclesiastical, the congregation, which is the basic form of the church for Protestants. And what form of political bodies are going to be? It's going to be civil, and since they knew Latin, they knew that civil is related to the Latin word cives, which is the word for citizen. It's a political body consisting of citizens. And the difference between that and being directly under the control of the king is that they get to pass their own laws. Fair and equal laws, they call them, for the general good. By the way, very interestingly, considering the future history of America, they never mention rights. They mention government for the general good. But there's one other part that's sort of interesting and significant for what we're talking about today. They mention that they're on a voyage to the northern parts of Virginia. In today's world, Massachusetts and Virginia isn't very close to one another. But of course, what they really meant is British North America, named after Queen Elizabeth, and so Virginia. However, it's not unlikely they did think that the climate in Massachusetts was going to be like the climate in Virginia. That it was going to be warm, and there was rich, fertile soil to grow cash crops. There wasn't the gold that the Spanish found down south, but there was the ability to grow tobacco. And that was worth a lot of money in the 17th century. I'm told that it still is. And it didn't turn out that way. The soil wasn't the kind that would grow tobacco easily. The climate had a long winter period, and the early years were rather tough. They're recounted in one of the first mini masterpieces of American literature, William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation, which I enthusiastically urge you to read. But time went by, and they, despite the early tough years, prospered. And after about 20 years, they realized if they were going to have a real society, they needed educated people, people who could become ministers for the right hand of God's rule over people, the church, and people who would become lawyers, helping to deal with the left hand of God's rule over things, the two ways that God rules for Luther and for Calvin. And so in 1639, they form Harvard College. And a few years later, they discover they're going to need entrance requirements. And the very first entrance requirements for these people in a new land, a place they've had to carve out everything themselves, working hard, creating it. The first entrance requirement for Harvard College is, quotes, to be able to read Tully or such like classical Latin author extempore. Tully is Cicero. His name is Marcus Tullius Cicero, and Tullius becomes Tully for them, just like the great Roman historian Livius becomes Livy, and just like the writer of the great epistles of Plinius became Pliny. Pliny's epistles include two, which are eyewitness accounts of the explosion of Mount Vesuvius. So they're really, really very interesting to read and be involved in it. And it must be said that this requirement was not a peculiarity of the Puritan founders of Harvard. Cicero requirement is found in the records of other colonial colleges, William and Mary, 1693, Yale, 1701, College of New Jersey, 1746. You know it better as Princeton. King's College, New York, 1754, now known as Columbia. So why did Americans want people to be able to read Cicero as the prerequisite for beginning their collegiate invocation? It must be said that a Cicero entrance requirement for college doesn't fit with the image of America's founders as living a life free from the dead hand of the past. In 1783, French immigrant Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur, in his Letters from an American Farmer, although he was French, but he was a farmer in America, asked that great question, quotes, what then is the American, this new man, end quotes. And de Crèvecoeur answered, quotes, he is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. And over 200 years after de Crèvecoeur, Dinesh D'Souza, in his book, What's So Great About America, echoed these words. Dinesh wrote, quotes, as the American founders knew, America is a new kind of society that produces a new kind of human being. That human being, confident, self-reliant, tolerant, generous, future-oriented, is a vast improvement over the wretched, servile, fatalistic, and intolerant human being that traditional societies have always produced and that Islamic societies produce now, end quotes. I would say something intolerant, but I'm too servile to do that. The fact is that 17th and 18th century Americans, so far from leaving behind them all their ancient prejudices and manners, brought over not only their national heritage of the English language and the English common law, but the cultural baggage of the ancient Mediterranean lock, stock, and barrel. It's hard for us to appreciate what is going on here. Colonial educators tried to immerse their students in the past, reading Cicero, reading Virgil. Today we think the future will belong to those who innovate, and so if that's going to work, our education should be innovative. A progressive educator wants to liberate students from the dead hand of the past. Ever since Edward Thorndike and Robert S. Woodward in the 1920s, educational research has been used to oppose a traditional classical curriculum. An interesting exception may be provided by the research of psychologist K. Anders Ericsson of Florida State on what he calls experts, acknowledged masters in many different fields and occupations. Ericsson himself is the expert on experts. His research studies the most successful practitioner of a wide range of different skills and professions, ranging from policemen to chess players. Chess, for example, is a challenging intellectual activity. Winning involves making moves that your opponent does not anticipate. The communis opinio is that grandmasters win by thinking ahead more moves than their opponents. Ericsson's research, however, shows little correlation with innovation, but significant correlation with hours spent playing over and over the games of earlier grandmasters. This is the summary by Joshua Foer, F-O-E-R, in his book Moonwalking with Einstein. Quotes, using magnetoencephalography, a technique that measures the weak magnetic fields given off by a thinking brain, researchers have found that higher-rated chess players are more likely to engage the frontal and parietal cortices of the brain when they look at the board, which suggests they're recalling information from long-term memory. Lower-ranked players are more likely to engage the medial temporal lobes, which suggests they are encoding new information. End quotes. Let me summarize. Amateur chess players innovate. Grandmasters remember. Outstanding achievement involves knowing the past. By immersion in the past, the classical canon aims at creating grandmasters not of chess, but of citizenship. If the goal of education is to produce what I've just called grandmasters of citizenship, to teach students to think, communicate, and lead, then we must acknowledge, and I'm going to argue, that Cicero is the Grand Master of citizenship. Our story, however, I already said I began in the middle, goes back a couple of hundred years to the 14th century. It was a very exciting period intellectually in European history. St. Thomas Aquinas had shown how Aristotelian logic could be used to defend the Christian faith in a very interesting and impressive way that people who are Thomists think solved most of the problems of Christian theology. However, having shown what you could do with logic only encouraged other philosophers to try and use logic to raise other questions. And the most important of them was a man named William of Ockham, who invented his own contribution to logic, not beyond Aristotle and different from his, dealing not just with noun and predicate, but also with general statements. He called it suppositional logic, and historians of logic say it's the ancestor of our modern symbolic logic, with modern philosophers used. And doing that, he caused a lot of questions to arise in theology. While this was going on, elsewhere in Europe, in Italy, there was a man named Petrarch. Petrarch had been born near Florence, but his father got involved in what we now call lawfare and got driven out of town. And Petrarch got a job working for the person who was technically the Bishop of Rome, but who was living in Avignon in southern France. And Petrarch found a lot of time to travel around Europe for his work. And when he did, he would always go to local monasteries and local libraries to see what he could find. And he especially was successful in discovering manuscripts of Livy, who I've already mentioned, and of Cicero. And in 1354, he wandered in the city of Verona in northern Italy into the library and discovered the letters that Cicero had written to his best friend Atticus, and letters he'd written to his greatest political ally, Marcus Brutus. If you're a Shakespeare fan, that's et tu Brute. That's the Brutus that he knew. And when he did, he discovered that Cicero, whom he knew as somebody who talked in great philosophical terms about how not to let misfortune bother you, and how understanding that your own soul is the most important part of you and not what other people think of you, discovered a man who was an active politician, who had tremendous triumphs, but also terrible defeats, and was very excited and committed to being an active political member of his society, not someone who stood apart from it. And Petrarch himself was quite shocked. He actually wrote a letter to Cicero in which he said, "I still think you're the greatest writer of Latin prose. And I still think your speeches are the greatest speeches ever done. But gee, you shouldn't have gotten so involved in politics. Didn't you know that God's will is more important than that? And that's what you ought to be worried about? Please, please, Cicero. I mean, if only you were alive in 14th century Avignon, you would understand this." Interestingly enough, the people in Italy who lived in Florence didn't have the attitude of Petrarch. They were excited. They wanted to have a republic. And they discovered that the greatest writer that they knew, there were some Greek writers they were to learn about later, and the greatest speech maker and one of the great ethical philosophers from the ancient world, Cicero, was also actively involved in the political life of his society and excited by it and happy about success and devastated by failure. And the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th century is a period in which the people of Florence again and again turned to Cicero as their model in trying to form what we would call a republican form of government, a consensual form of government. It wasn't pure democracy. A lot of it was done based on the guilds, we would call them unions, not so much the individual one man, one vote idea. But they tried very hard. Ultimately, they did not succeed. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that. Some very smart people belonging to the Medici family, Cosimo de' Medici and Lorenzo, his grandson, were masters of finance capitalism, and they were able to create a political machine using the money they had, which put them effectively in control of Florence for the whole second two-thirds of the 15th century. After the death of Lorenzo, there was a 20-year period where Athens resumed its political republican ideals, but eventually the Medici came back and ruled them until Napoleon showed up in the 19th century. However, it was too late. Cicero's ideas were already all over the place, and they were found in everywhere throughout Europe, even places you wouldn't especially expect it. One of the people who is often misunderstood his real attitudes was Martin Luther. We think of Martin Luther as a religious reformer, but first he was a humanist. He came to the University of Wittenberg, which had just been founded to teach the Bible, but he was a believer in humanism, in the great works of the Christian ancient world, St. Augustine especially, but also the pagan ancient world. And he got the University of Wittenberg to hire the most brilliant young humanist in Germany, a guy named Philip Melanchthon, who was the Carlos Alcaraz of humanism. He was 18 years old, and unlike Carlos Alcaraz, he looked a little bit nerdy, but when he stood up and spoke, audiences went wild. And the curriculum at Wittenberg was changed from a traditional scholastic one, arguing problems in theology based on logic, either Aristotelian logic or William of Occam's suppositional logic, to one in which you read the great classics of the ancient world and the great classics of Christian literature, including especially Augustine. And then, after Erasmus published the Greek text of the New Testament in 1516, then to reading the Bible directly. And in fact, the first work that Melanchthon had published in Wittenberg to teach his students was Cicero's great work, De Officiis, on duties. And both Luther and Melanchthon said over and over again, of course, for theology, for knowledge of God, the Bible is nonpareil. But for living the life of a citizen, Cicero should be our great motto. And so 100 years later, when the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts, what they did was eventually when they founded Harvard College, insist that Cicero was a requirement for getting in. The result was that the world changed dramatically from this point of view till we get to the 18th century. And it's very hard to say this without seeming to be trying to make too much of something. But for most people who teach the 18th century now, the 18th century is about the Enlightenment. It's an anti-traditional time. It's a time when traditional institutions and traditional ways of thinking are made fun of. It's Voltaire and his great mockery. It's Condorcet, his idea of inevitable progress. There's Rousseau. The fact is, many of the greatest people in the 18th century were not philosophes, as they called themselves, philosophers. They were Ciceronian traditionalists. When David Hume wrote his great works on philosophy, he begins by saying, once Aristotle was the most important philosopher, but nowadays Cicero has totally outdone him. When John Adams went to Harvard, he got the literature, he got the Intellectual Student Award, which was a book, Conyers Middleton's Life of Cicero. And unlike most college courses where students are sleeping through and reading this local paper and whatnot, it changed John Adams' life. He wanted to be a lawyer. He wanted to be like Cicero. And we have a wonderful passage in his diary as a young man where he says, I got up today and I read the 4 Catilinarians of Marcus Tullius, and not only did they excite me for their beauty and for their rhythm, but they got me sweating. And I felt so much healthier after I'd read them. We jog, right? And we do various other things. But John Adams read Cicero out loud at the top of his voice. And by the way, it isn't only John Adams. If you look at the Library of Americans edition of Thomas Jefferson, you'll see, of course, the Declaration of Independence. You'll see his one book, Notes on the State of Virginia. But 90% of there are letters. And they're letters because Cicero's letters were so influential, and they influenced Petrarch also to write letter after letter, so that was a sign of where you stood educationally. And many of Jefferson's most important ideas, as they influence us, come from his letters. And he purposely worked on them in imitation of Petrarch, who was an imitation of Cicero. And if I was to name one other figure, probably the greatest mind in a England full of great minds, and certainly Hume, a very brilliant person, was Edmund Burke. If Hume wasn't the most brilliant, Burke was. And Burke, we value him for his defense of the colonies in the American Revolution, which used to be studied in American schools. We value him for his insights on the reflections on the revolution in France, which he published in 1790, before any of the violence had started. Burke warned people about this. But in fact, Burke himself spent 7 years bringing up for trial a man named Warren Hastings, who was in charge of British India, on the grounds that he had misused what he had done. And he even got him impeached by the House of Commons. Then he had to be tried by the House of Lords. He did it because Cicero had devoted the first part of his career to going after the crooked governor of Sicily, Verres. And Burke wanted to have that part of Cicero's life as part of his image of himself, protecting the people of India from someone who was misusing what they were doing. So the importance of this is clear enough. If you actually look at what the people in the 18th century were doing, many of the greatest people then were people who, in fact, were influenced by Cicero, not by Voltaire. We have a problem today. A lot of people have felt it. Recent books have noted there's a dire plight of citizenship. Tony Woodleaf's I, Citizen, Victor Davis Hanson's The Dying Citizen, articulate and factual descriptions of the reason why many Americans feel they're no longer self-governing participants in political decisions making on the local, state, and national level. And they have very good ideas, although they don't mention the classics, which is too bad in the case of Dr. Hanson, who's quite a good classicist. Pete Hedges and David Goodwin, in their battle for the American mind, do devote a lot of attention to the fact that what the classical education can do for citizenship. Let me just mention Cicero, who was built into the classical curriculum. You spent a year studying Latin grammar, a year reading Caesar, then you read Cicero, fourth year you read Virgil. The traditional reading for third year Latin is Cicero's Catilinarian speeches, same speeches that John Adams loved so much. Cicero was the democratically elected consul in the year 63 BC when he confronted an attempt by the patrician Catiline to assassinate the duly elected consul, who was Cicero, by the way, and to lead an armed force against the Roman Republic. Now, Cicero was a civilian, never a general, but by his forethought and his brilliant oratory, he preserved the duly constituted Roman state. Eventually, his fellow consul Antonius led a military force that defeated Catiline's army, and Catiline died in the battle. When students study Cicero in third year Latin, they're learning grammar, they're learning vocabulary, they're learning oratory. All those things are wonderful things. But they're also seeing a prudent and eloquent civilian who defended the rule of law from violent revolutionaries. We're learning something ethical and political while they're learning grammar and vocabulary and rhetoric. And that's my argument for Cicero. People from the 14th century to just virtually the other day, the 1960s, when still 1 million kids in public schools studied Latin. And that doesn't even count the kids in Catholic schools, Episcopalian prep schools, Lutheran schools. And they built into the education was an understanding of the great periods of consensual rule in ancient Rome, and if you study Greek, also in the Greek democracy. And so that you didn't have, the solution for the problems now is often conservatives get is adding a semester of civics to the high school curriculum. The problem with that is civics taught that way are a bunch of facts. I like Jeopardy as much as the next guy, so I don't mean to put down facts. Facts are a wonderful thing. But when you studied the Latin curriculum, you also learned what actually happened and the people who were behind it and the arguments that were used and the dangers that they faced. And it wasn't always successful, of course. There were defeats, as Petrarch learned when he read Cicero's letters, as well as victories. But you also could learn that there was a time when civilians doing the right thing could stop people trying to use violence and keep them from overturning their government and their way of life. And this is a vision that Cicero had. There is so much great scholarship on Cicero. If you get interested in him, 20th century scholarship has been quite impressive. But there were people in the 18th century, and not insignificant, David Hume, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Edmund Burke, who in a way understood Cicero much better than any of the great modern scholars, who I'm very humble before. They're terrific scholars. But none of these scholars did what those four men did, that is, model their lives on Cicero. And that's why I'm putting Cicero, I don't put Cicero equal, obviously, to Socrates and Jesus, but he's somebody for those of us who live in consensual institutions. To get to know him is to get to know somebody who still has a lot to say to us. And he can improve our vocabulary, and he can help us write more grammatically, but also he teaches us how to stand up for free institutions without giving up free institutions. And that's my argument for why you should read Cicero. Thank you very much.